My name is Jeanne Robinson, and I'm here as a friend of the library in conjunction with the Veterans History Project. This morning we are going to interview Mr. Richard Gile, who has a distinguished career in the United States Army, and we look forward to capturing his oral history this morning. To begin, Mr. Gile, perhaps we could begin with a little bit of your biographical information, if you could tell us about your early life, where you were born and where you were raised.
I was born in Buffalo, New York. When I was 5 years old, it was so cold I decided to move to Connecticut. And raised in Connecticut during the Depression, child of the Great Depression. And we had very little, as you can imagine. In fact, I became a paper boy at 11 years of age in order to help the family. And later on, when I was in high school, I worked at a separate job, went to high school 3 to 11. I'm sorry, 8 to 1 and 3 to 11 in a factory. And that's the early life that I had, of course. And when the Pearl Harbor occurred, that changed my whole life.
And it was that event that caused you then to enter into the United States military service?
My sister and my aunt and my mother and I were in a theater in Hartford, Connecticut, watching a movie. And suddenly the movie stopped. The manager came out and said, Pearl Harbor's been bombed. There are many people dead, many Navy casualties, and so on. That's about all I could hear. But on the way home, I turned my little radio on in my 1935 Ford convertible, listened to it a little bit more. And before we arrived home, I told my mother and my aunt and sister, I'm going to enlist in the Army tomorrow morning.
What was your next step then? Did you have a recruiting station nearby?
I went to New Haven, Connecticut, to the recruiting station. There were about 1,000 people there, 1,000 others trying to enlist. And so they said, come back on December the 13th, and we'll give you your physical, and you'll be in the Army then. So I missed the December 8th date by a few days. Nevertheless, on the 13th, I was inducted in the Army.
So you moved right out and began your new life in the military.
Absolutely.
And then you were sent to basic training.
I was sent to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, for induction. And there, I'd listened for the Army Air Corps. And but there, I got shut off into the Quartermaster Corps. For one reason or the other, I don't want to mention what it is, but in any event, I became a quartermaster, and I was in supply. That was my training, early training.
Did you have an opportunity at some later point to move to a different specialty?
I would say I wouldn't have moved, I was shoved into the infantry.
And did the infantry turn out to be a good place for you?
It was not a great experience at that particular time, but since then I really appreciate the fact that I was in the infantry in World War II long enough to have survived 8 months of combat, and I'm proud of that accomplishment. And I earned the Combat Infantry Badge and a Brown Star. So,
That's quite an accomplishment.
yeah. And I was in the infantry later on in Korea, and later on I was an infantry paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division. So the infantry really is my home, not the Quartermaster Corps.
Right. What was your first assignment after basic training?
First assignment was at Camp Livingston, Louisiana. That doesn't exist anymore. It's near Alexandria. And it was a pretty bad location, believe me. And at that time, there were 500,000 troops in Louisiana. I guess someone mentioned that it had been a battleship, it would have sunk. And, okay, shall I go on from there?
You can go on from there,
Okay,
sure.
great. I became a supply sergeant in an outfit called the Sterilization and Bath Unit, Quartermaster Unit. From World War I, it was nicknamed the Bugs and Gas Unit. In any event, I decided I wanted to do something better, so I applied for OCS and for the cadet training in Army Air Corps at the same time. OCS came through first. I guess they needed a cannon fodder for the ground forces. They sent me to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, 18 years old. Okay? And there I was a candidate for 9 weeks. I'm sorry, 7 weeks. And the 7th week, we were building a bridge in the estuary of the Potomac, and I fell off the bridge and slipped off, and it was sleet-covered bridge. And I stayed out there the rest of the day, caught pneumonia, and was hospitalized for 4 or 5 weeks. When I got back, they said, well, you're immature. You're too immature to be an officer. You should have told us to come home, get cleaned up, and you wouldn't have caught pneumonia. So go back to your unit. So they sent me back to Camp Livingston. But my unit had already gone to North Africa. And instead, they assigned me to an ordnance company where I was supply sergeant. Okay. That was the early.
Okay. All right. And then how did your career progress then as the war gained momentum, and we know that ultimately you participated in Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge.
We were sent to England. It was in the ordnance company, and I became I was a supply sergeant there, and I became a first sergeant, by the way, while I was in England. However, it's a long story to that. We did go to Normandy after remaining in Normandy for England for a year, and we were assigned to Patton's Army, General Patton's Army. That was called the Secret Army of World War II. General Patton was his great disgrace, and with General Eisenhower and General Bradley, but Eisenhower recognized his value as a great leader, and he formed a secret army in England, even though he was accused of insulting the British at a tea. Nevertheless, he was put in command, and we went to Normandy, and I landed with his army on July 21st, 1944. Okay.
And how long were you in that theater?
I was there until 1945, until September of 45. So now you want how I got into the infantry.
Yes.
That's very important. When we got close to Paris, the company commander, and who was kind of an inadequate guy in my opinion, as a first sergeant, I'd done a lot of helping him, if you will, kind of covering for him. He set me in charge of the company, and they went to Paris, me and the lieutenants. So I disobeyed an order, and I went and got some trucks and took all the 140 troops to Fontainebleau for a little foray for one day. Unfortunately, they were all sworn to secrecy, but 2 of them were picked up by the military police. When I got back, of course, the company commander came back. He was furious and going to court-martial me and send me to probably to Leavenworth or someplace back in England where the prison. So he gave me an option and reduced me to a lower grade and transferred me to the infantry, and that's where I became a squad leader. That's how it happened.
Well,
So I say
I've
had a checkered career, not the ordinary one.
Well, so okay, now you're in the infantry,
Yeah.
and
I was assigned to the 26th Infantry Division as a replacement in September of 1944. I was in Company E, 104th Infantry Regiment, as a squad leader. And it doesn't take long to learn how to be a squad leader in the infantry. About 1 week of survival. If you survive the first week, you're a squad leader. And we fought. General Patton had orders to fight through the Saar Valley all the way to Metz from approximately Nancy, France, in the fall. The weather was terrible, rain, snow, casualties were very high in Company E. And in fact, I had about 30 days out while I went back to the hospital. And I got back to the unit just in time for attack on the Fortress Metz in France. And we captured that in early December. And we were resting. We were supposed to be in reserve for a week or two, and suddenly we were ordered. We heard something about a big operation up in Ardennes Forest. We had no idea where it was, but we were heard about it. we were put on a 24-hour alert, 12-hour alert, and a 2-hour alert. And oh, by the way, by that time we only had about 40 men of a 180-man company, so we were filled with replacements. It came from nowhere, out of nowhere. I literally mean that. The American Army had hit the bottom of the manpower barrel and by the late fall of 1944. All the projections by all the leaders everywhere was the war was going to end in the fall of 44. It did not. So many of the replacements came from the mess hall, from the ordnance, from the quartermaster, from the signal corps, from everywhere. We were trained those replacements in 3 days. We taught them how to throw a grenade. Some had never fired their rifles since basic training. Let them fire their rifles and showed them how to fire a 60mm mortar and a machine gun, and they were infantrymen.
They got their training on the front lines.
Yeah.
Did you work with or serve with Allied forces?
Not at that time, no.
Not at that time. Can you tell us the circumstances associated with your receiving the combat infantry badge?
Well, the combat infantry badge is awarded for 30 days in actual armed combat against an enemy. Now, many of us, if you survive 30 days, receive the combat infantry badge. Now, many of us served much longer and were awarded it, regardless of the 30-day requirement. And but Eisenhower said once, some people tell me it's a stretch, but I don't believe it. He said, of all the decorations I had, he said, I would have preferred the combat infantry badge even over the Purple Heart. So, so that's what the combat infantry badge is all about. You're facing an armed enemy in combat, and your chances of survival in the infantry are very slow, very slim. The average second lieutenant in combat lasted 18 minutes in World War II, and in Korea, and in Vietnam. It was even less in Vietnam, 15 minutes. So that's why it's so very proud of wearing the combat infantry badge.
Right. Were there moments, I'm sure, when you thought you might not survive?
Yes, many moments. And, in fact, there's a good book written by a lieutenant who was in the adjacent company of mine, lives in Brewton, Alabama now. It's called Company G. And he and a sergeant kept a daily journal of combat. And that book, when I read it, I thought, my gosh, I didn't know how bad things were. Because you're living from hand to mouth, you're living in dirt, mud, you're living in cold, heat, you're living momentarily. Tomorrow, at another minute, you may be dead, you may be wounded, and you see the people around you. Some of you really never knew. Suddenly they're wounded or killed or dragged off, and you're made to do things that really a human being shouldn't do. So that's why I'm proud of that service.
Yes, and we thank you for your service.
You're welcome. They pay me pretty well for it now. We'll get to that later.
All right. Well, you witnessed a lot of action. You experienced a lot of loss. You're a member of the greatest generation, where many of you came home and resumed life. What was it like when you came back from the war?
Well, can we get to that a little bit later?
Yes, we can.
Talk a little about.
Yes.
We were in Metz, France. We were sent to the Battle of the Bulge, is what it was called. The Germans had attacked a weak place in our line with about 250 to 300,000 troops, with tank heavy, a lot of tanks. And so it was a desperate time for the American Army, because the first time in the history of our Army, an entire division surrendered to the Germans. That's how bad it was. The situation was very untenable. So Patton was assigned to take an entire division out of the line. It never happened before or since. Out of the combat line, facing the Germans, pulled them out. We got into trucks, open trucks. They drove us 100 miles up to Luxembourg. And there we attacked the southern flank of the Bulge. And Patton said, the Krauts have got their head in a meat grinder, and I've got the handle, and I'm going to turn it. And every day we attacked, we got off the trucks in Arlon, Luxembourg, and we attacked toward Wiltz for nearly every day for about 20 days. And it was extremely cold. The temperature was the worst weather in Europe in 50 years. We were in snow, sometimes up to our panties, sometimes it was sleet, sometimes it was, to dig a foxhole, you had to dig through some frost, maybe 3 or 4 inches. And we didn't have any picks, we had just those entrenching shovels. And we put pine boughs in the bottom, straw if we had them. And an ice fog set in too. I call it an ice fog, that's what we called it, extreme fog. We were in the Ardennes forest, in a deep forest, and death would come out of the fog momentarily from some kind of fire, artillery, mortars, small arms. After a week, and I'll take that back, we arrived there in December the 17th in Arlon and attacked, and 2 days later toward Wiltz, Luxembourg. Company E was in the lead that morning. We were headed toward the village of Redonge, Luxembourg, and the Germans had a counterattack at the same time, and we met them at the edge of that village. We scrambled for the high ground, and my platoon got on top of a ridge overlooking the town, and we saw a German column of about four columns, I should say, moving up toward us, and we realized that one platoon on a ridge line like that was going to be outmanned in all probability and probably would be overwhelmed. Nevertheless, we got a little mortar out and fired on them, but they returned our fire and had 3 men wounded immediately. Tree bursts from the mortars, and we dragged them off into the woods and got some medics. They came up from I don't know where, they evacuated them. Platoon sergeant and I decided maybe we better get the Lord out of there, because we were about to be, we knew we were going to be attacked by perhaps 300 or 400. It was only 40 or 45 men. And so we ran back to Company G. And by the way, a little side to that, I was running across a snow-covered field under fire as fast as my legs would carry me, about 1.5 feet of snow. And suddenly, I had this terrible pain in my toes, and I fell. And my first thought was, I must be hit in the toes. But my legs were still functioning, so I got up and looked down, and I had tripped over a frozen cow chip. So I got up and ran again. So that's like me. And anyhow, during the next 4 or 5 days, we did manage to eventually take that ridge line. We surrounded the Germans. Unfortunately, we had some self-propelled artillery that came up. They creamed the Germans for 3 days and 3 nights. I almost felt sorry for them, but not quite, because they were dug in pretty well. But the next morning, this morning of December 22nd, we attacked and went down through the positions, and most of them were dead or wounded. I captured a young German soldier, came up from behind him, and he was stunned. I dragged him out of the foxhole by his overcoat. And there's a good story behind that, because about 12 years ago, my wife and I were on a cruise, and we won first prize at a little contest, and the MC asked me, "Are you in battles?" I said, "Yes, I was in the Battle of Bulge in Europe." And I said, "I was in Luxembourg." Afterward, this fellow came up to me, a little German accent. He said, I was in the Battle of the Bulge." We compared notes, and there was a German soldier I had captured on that.
Oh, my word.
He was only 16 years old, by the way. And he said, I said, "Why would you remember me?" He said, "You got me out of the war." That was important to him. That was that important.
Well, you had lasting relationships on both sides.
Well, after about December 26th, they brought me to battalion to be the battalion patrol leader. I had 10 men, and we patrols nearly every day or night with 5 men looking for the German positions, scouting them out. Patrol work consisted of going out between the lines, lying down in the snow, watching to see if the machine gun was fired, listening for a mortar, trying to get a compass direction on where it came from, listening for tanks. And by the way, the Germans were short of tanks after a while, so if I found out in going in, getting through their lines, and lying down beside the road with myself, and back here some distance away, they were running one tank up and down parallel to the lines, fake that they had more tanks there.
Did you have adequate supplies?
We had no supplies, if you will, for winter weather. We had little wool knit caps, our overcoats, and our field jackets underneath. And we didn't have any kind of shoes with our leggings in. And we had just some cotton wool gloves. And we were not prepared for that, and neither was the Army. The logisticians had planned for the war to be over in the fall of '44. And during that time, I was a patrol leader. One night, let's put it this way, the battalion was being shelled frequently by artillery, and there was a barn overlooking the area. Okay, so I was assigned with my patrol to go up and investigate the barn. When we got close to the barn, we worked our way up there in the snow, one step at a time. We got about 40 or 50 feet. I heard it was what I thought was a machine gun bolt being drawn. So I signaled, we did it with hand signals, turn around and go back. We started back. A mortar round was dropped in front of us, and then a mortar round was dropped in back of us. And I realized we were being bracketed. So I said, take off as fast as we could. It's a good thing we did, because they had a brace of 6 mortars that landed where we had been. And anyhow, that's the kind of thing I did during the Bulge. Afterward, we were assigned down to Saarland, Germany. And we were there on a bridgehead across the Saar River. And again, I was the patrol leader, and we did patrols. The patrols, the fighting was such from building to building, so we oftentimes just peered around the corner to see if there were Germans. That was a night patrol, and come back and say there are no Germans on that side. And during that time, I was on a patrol, and we stayed out between buildings for most of the night. And returning to battalion headquarters, we had to go through a pot and pan factory that had been mostly destroyed, pots and pans all over the place. And the Germans saw us go into the building, so they machine gunned the building. And we were lying there on the floor of the building, and the rounds were going wing wang, bing bang on the pots and pans, but none of us got hit. And finally, we found a window in the back and crawled out the window and got back. 19th March of 45, we attacked Trier, from Trier into Germany. And there we, the whole division eventually crossed the Rhine. And I was still a patrol leader. In fact, after a while, we didn't have any patrols, so we were very resistant. So I was the battalion commander's choice for his guard, riding with him. And we went out to the villages sometimes a little bit ahead. And he had a big box in the back, and he'd take the silverware and the pistols and shotguns and that sort of thing. And we went into Austria, and we went through Bavaria, by the way, and the redoubt. And fortunately, it was not a great deal of resistance. On one occasion, we did meet great resistance. An SS company was escaping from Berlin, and we fought all day with them for that. The battalion commander had been in that village the day before, a few miles away from the battalion. There was no one there. So, but in any event, eventually ended the war in Czechoslovakia. And there we captured the remnants of the 85th German Corps. It was only 5,000 men, would have originally been probably 90,000 men, commanded by a major. And I'll never forget him. He looked like Erich von Stroheim, the movie director, with a bald head and a jawed person, and a monocle. And one night I brought him a bottle of wine. We sat in his command car, and he said, "I've never forgotten this." He said, he said, "The Germans want you Americans, we must go to attack the Bolsheviks. You will be sorry if you don't." I've never forgotten those words, because many times later during the Gulf War, when Germany was threatened with invasion from the Russians, I thought, the guy had a point.
Oh, interesting.
I was returned to the States in September of '45, and
What was that homecoming like?
well, it was great. We sailed in New York Harbor. I can always remember that somehow there was a whack band, a women's auxiliary corps, on a ferry boat, and they serenaded us as we came up the Hudson River. And also, I remember this, as one of the wives somehow had gotten on that ferry, and she knew her husband was on that ship, and he almost jumped overboard. Also, as we passed the Statue of Liberty, there wasn't a dry eye. You're talking about hardened combat veterans, and there wasn't a dry eye, I don't think. So, but when I arrived in Camp Kimmer, I was sick. I was quite ill. It turned out I had yellow jaundice, and I was in the hospital at Fort Devens for 3 months. Finally discharged in January of '46. That's World War II.
You had so many experiences there, and it sounds like you never had any time off to speak of during all of that while that you were in Europe, or did you?
Yes,
did you
after
have
the war. After the war.
Recreation of any
After
kind?
the war, yes, after the war, we were trained down to by 40 and 8s. 40 and 8s is 40 men and 8 horses. That's a freight car. The French named them 40 hommes and 8 chevaux. And we were trained in these, put on a train and sent from Stuttgart, I guess it was, maybe, down to Riviera. We had a week in the Riviera. And that was a good experience, too.
Hollywood had a lot of support for the men and women in the armed forces. Were you ever able to see a USO
Yes,
show?
after the war, I saw Bob Hope and Bing Crosby at a golf course in Fontainebleau. Fontainebleau, as the French call it.
So now you're home, and
I left the service, and I went to New Haven College, and nights. In the meantime, I was with a management training program with R. Wallace and Company, who made sterling silver in Wallingford, Connecticut. And but I joined the National Guard in 1948, and got my associate bachelor of science degree in industrial management. Then I was with Winchester Army Company for a year, and the Army called me to active duty in September of 1950. In June of 1950, we were in a rifle range, and sitting around in a tent, listening to radio, having a beer. Somebody said, "North Korea's been invaded South Korea." Where is North Korea? Where is South Korea? So, and about 45 days later, I found out where it was. They called me as the first lieutenant, and I was a company commander of an infantry rifle company. And again, same thing. We had trained people. All the lessons from World War II were almost forgotten. And because I was a combat experienced guy, I was highly sought for, and maybe a company commander. And the conditions were very poor at Camp Pickett, Virginia, by the way. We had old barracks falling apart from World War II. We didn't have enough uniforms for everyone, not enough weapons, not enough jeeps. And here we're going to go to Korea in 3 or 4 months. And, so every war, it seems to me, is that we have to relearn the same lessons, and we downsize, and then we get ready again, and we go through the same experience over and over again. It seems that way. And,
we know at some point you got paratrooper training, and you
Yes.
became a member of the 82nd Airborne. Can
Yeah.
you tell us about that?
Yes, after Korea, and I was signed to Germany after Korea, and I became a general's aide in the 43rd Infantry Division in Germany. And when my tour was up there, the division commander asked me what I wanted to do, and I said, I want to go to the 82nd Airborne Division. So I was transferred there and trained. I commanded Company B, 505 Infantry for 2 years there. And that was a good experience for me. And in fact, the last 3 months, I commanded a provisional battalion as a captain, which was an honor. And we went off to Indiantown Gap to change the National Guard, train the National Guardsmen and reservists. And from there, I was walking down Chicken Road at Fort Bragg one night in the rain. I was thinking, God, I've been through this so many times, the wet, the rain, and as an infantryman, what am I doing here? Why don't I apply for flight school? So, Army flight school. When I got back to Fort Bragg, I did. And I went through flight training in 1956. And from there, here's a graph of me. I graduated the day. That's kind of, I broke that coming over here. That's the day I graduated from flight school at Fort Rucker, Alabama. And, from there, I was assigned to Korea, and as I think I mentioned you earlier when we were pre-interview, I learned how to fly. They don't teach you how to fly in flight school. They teach the rudiments. And I flew 1,000 hours in 16 months in Korea, and I became an advisor to the ROK Army, the Republic of Korea Army. I was assigned to 3rd ROK Corps Aviation Group, and from there I was assigned to be the senior advisor to the Army Aviation School in Korea. And see, it was, I think I made major about that time, maybe a little bit later, I can't remember now. After Korea, I made major. And had some good experiences there with the Koreans. I learned a little bit of Korean, Hanyashim Nika, Choembeka Simnida, and so on, and talked the language a little bit, and taught them how to, I actually was a check pad for the Korean students, and I found out quickly that transition from something that does 30 miles an hour to something that does 90 miles, so 100 miles an hour is difficult for the Koreans. I have a picture, and we have it with me, where engine failed and we went into a rice paddy, but only broke one of the gear and the wing. And from there, I was returned to the States, and I was in the chief of the Doctrine Division at Fort Rucker, Alabama, chief of the Tactics Department, and there I helped to develop low-level flying. That was very important because I found out earlier that our aircraft really were not prepared for combat. There was the small helicopters, the H-13, the Bubbles, and the fixed wing, the L-19s, and even our Beavers, and so on. They were not prepared for combat. Yet here we were trained to go into combat again. We were in Europe. It was possibly going to get hot, and it was possible the Russians were going to intervene, right? And invade Europe. In any event, Army aviation came into its own because we were able to move people rapidly into combat. We could eventually move an entire battalion 100 miles in 2 hours. And if you compare that to going over the road, in fact, we would not have ever have been able to have been in Vietnam at all if it had not been for Army aviation. Our helicopters hauled just about everybody and his brother, the supplies, the men, the beer, and everything else, and in Vietnam.
You participated.
From there, I went to. Oh, by the way, there's some schools on the sides. I went to the advanced course. I went to the Industrial College, the Armed Forces, and also there it was taught the logistics of economics, and so that was a helpful experience. On return from there, I was assigned to Fort Benning to combat developments, and since I was an Army aviator and a combat veteran to wars in the infantry was given a proponency for the development of that helicopter, which was unique all by itself. And the infantrymen didn't know anything about flying. So I was at Johnny on the spot. I fell into the right place, and had flown Huey and knew a lot about how to fly in combat. And so they assigned me to write a requirement for a new helicopter to replace the Huey, because the Huey is highly vulnerable. We lost 50% of our Hueys in Vietnam to a hole in the engine, where even the rifle people were being trained to home in on the engine. And also, a number were lost to hydraulic failures. So they, excuse me, they decided that I was the guy for that purpose. And I spent 2 years working on what was called a requirement for the Utility Tactical Air Transport System, which eventually became the Black Hawk. And that was a challenge in itself, because we had to convince everyone, including the Congress, that we had a need for a much better machine. And that matriculated into becoming the Black Hawk helicopter eventually. I retired in 1967 as Lieutenant Colonel. And by the way, during that time also I had a side project, was to write the first manual on air assault operations. And I did that as well. But to be truthful about it, I took the airborne manual and I cut it up, pieced it together, used some of my own experience and get some operations orders from different places, and put that together in about 2 months. But that manual, many editions later, is still in existence.
Well, writing manuals maybe helped you prepare for the book that you're writing. Can you tell us about your book?
I don't think anyone prepared me for this book. And I was out of the service for a year, and I was in business for myself, in the consultant business. And one day I got a call from a assistant commandant at Fort Benning. He said, "Come out here, I want to talk with you." He said, "We don't know anything about this GD helicopter, the UTAS." He said, "Can you come out here and give us a hand?" I said, "Well, gee, I don't know, I've got business downtown." He said, "Tell you what, we'll make you a GS-13, and you may be able to go up from there." So I sold my business and went back to work for the Army and joined the Department of Defense and as a civilian. And I spent another 14 years helping develop the Black Hawk helicopter. And in fact, went to Fort Rucker to a little rally with some of the old guys, aviators, and just last week, and they honored me and gave me a little cap. And had some great adventures during that time, if you will, great adventures. I became a whistleblower on Sikorsky helicopter. As it happened, I was on the Source Selection Evaluation Board for both the selection of the first contract, and then for the prototype, and then for the selection of the final helicopter, which Sikorsky won the contract. There were competitions between Bell, Boeing, and Sikorsky. Sikorsky, God bless them, they produced a pretty good machine, but the time between the prototype and the production model, they left out 21 important items. And so I went to Sikorsky and went to the project manager, and my boss said, "Don't do that, you ruin my career." I said, "I gotta do this, this is very important." So eventually we managed to get 20 of the items put back into the helicopter that they finally produced. I had a badge to go anywhere in that factory. And because I was in industrial management and a Connecticut boy, I guess, and all that sort of thing. They were in Stratford. And so I went to the factory quite frequently, and I found out, knowing something about production. I've been with Winchester and with Wallace in production and management, and discovered that they were going to be 4 months late delivering the first production helicopter. And I blew the whistle on them. That's why I never got promoted to be John GS-13, I think. But the project manager for the Black Hawk has never forgotten that. I mean, when I called him and said, "I'm coming to Rucker," he set up a little thing for me and gave me that cap. We reminisced about some of those times.
I bet you did.
And so that's pretty much wraps up what I did for the Army and with the Army, and the Army did for me.
Well, you've had a very distinguished career encompassing many aspects.
A checkered career.
A checkered career. We'd say it was very interesting. I know that you are very interested in the events of today's world and in passing on your experiences and advice to younger generations. And probably many things stand out for you, but can you name a few things that stick out in your memory as and in your thinking as important lessons to pass down to our younger generations?
This event that occurred in Tucson really struck me pretty hard. And I've been thinking about this for a long time. Our country has declined greatly in many respects, and it's real hurtful to me that this has happened to our country. And we need great reform. I don't know how it's going to come about or whether it will come about, but we need to educate our children much better. We need to give our children a lot less and learn to get along with less. We've spoiled them. We've been permissive with them, and it's a difficult chore, I realize, to be a parent today. Extremely difficult. Our schools are not set up for discipline.